There is a certain kind of map from the 1700s that has a strange power over the imagination. You have probably seen one, even if you did not realize what you are looking at. A vast territory stretches across the parchment, covering lands from the edges of Russia through Central Asia, perhaps extending to the Pacific. But something is wrong. There is a name written in careful script across this empire: Tartaria, or sometimes Great Tartary. The letters span thousands of miles. They mark cities, regions, subdivisions. Chinese Tartaria, independent Tartaria, Muscovite Tartaria. The mapmaker has labeled this civilization with the same authority they gave to France, to Spain, to the Ottoman Empire. People in ornate clothing populate the illustrated margins. Grand buildings dot the landscape. Trade routes crisscross the territory. This was not a blank space on the map. This was a world, complete and detailed, as real to the cartographer as any European kingdom. And the strange thing is this: it was not just one map. It was not just one cartographer or one country's atlas or one isolated error that could be explained away as geographic confusion. These maps exist in archives across the world. Dutch atlases, French geography texts, British naval charts, Russian imperial surveys. Even maps printed for school children in the 1800s show the same vast empire. A civilization that appears on nearly every world map for over 200 years. If you search through old libraries, you begin to notice something unsettling. The maps are there. The empire is labeled. The territory is defined. But when you look at modern atlases, the name has vanished. The same geography exists, the same mountains, the same rivers, the same vast steppes, but Tartaria is gone. Erased, replaced by nations that seem to have appeared from nowhere. The mind rebels because the absence feels deliberate, calculated, something that should have an explanation, but doesn't. You stare at these old maps because the more you look, the more questions appear. If you feel like sharing, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what old buildings stand in your city. And just a gentle reminder, the maps and images in this episode are here only to help evoke the mood of the story. The mystery itself lives in the silence between what was recorded and what was remembered. Thank you for being here and walking these buried paths with us. Why would an empire that dominated world maps for centuries simply disappear from every modern textbook? Why would cartographers across nations all agree to label a massive territory only for that territory to be divided and renamed without explanation? Why does no museum have a Tartarian exhibit? Why does no university teach Tartarian history? Why do the maps show intricate cities and sophisticated civilization, yet historians dismiss it as merely a geographic placeholder? For years, these maps sat quietly in historical libraries and archive collections. Cartographers logged them and stored them away without suspecting that ordinary viewers would one day pull them from the shelves and think the same unsettling thought. If this empire covered maps for 200 years, where did it go, and why doesn't anyone seem to remember? But the maps are only the beginning, because when you start searching for traces of this vanished civilization, you discover something even more disturbing. You discover that the evidence isn't just on old parchment, it's beneath your feet. Walk through any major city built in the 19th century: Chicago, Boston, New York, San Francisco, London, Moscow, Melbourne, St. Petersburg, and look closely at the grand old buildings, not the modern structures, the ones from the 1800s with their heavy stone facades and elaborate ornamentation. Look at their foundations. Look at their windows. Look at where the ground floor actually sits. Something is wrong. The windows are too ornate for basements. The doorways are too grand for underground chambers. Staircases descend from street level to what should be the main entrance. The ground level sits exactly where the second floor should be.
These buildings don't look like they were constructed at current street level. They look like they were built for a different world, a world where the ground was 10, 15, sometimes 20 feet lower than it is now.
You kneel down beside a half-buried window and peer through. Inside, you can see the top portion of what was clearly once a magnificent entrance hall. Ornate plasterwork covers what is now the ceiling, but was obviously designed to be admired from floor level. Chandeliers hang in the darkness below the street. Stone columns, carved with impossible detail, rise from depths you cannot see. The craftsmanship is exquisite, the work of master artisans who expected their creation to be seen, admired, walked through by generations. But instead, it's buried, hidden, erased by the rising earth itself. Stand up, look around. How many buildings on this street share the same feature? How many have these half-submerged windows, these two elegant basements, these inverted doorways? All of them. Nearly every structure built before 1900 shows the same impossible characteristic. The first floor is underground. You walk to the courthouse, the library, the old train station, the cathedral, the opera house. Building after building reveals the same architectural paradox. And then you start to wonder, who builds palaces underground? And if they didn't build them that way, what buried them? This is when the investigation truly begins, because you've just noticed what thousands of people walk past every single day without seeing. You've just recognized a pattern that shouldn't exist, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The city around you transforms from familiar to foreign. Every old building becomes a question mark. Every street becomes a mystery. Every foundation becomes a potential tomb. Because if these buildings weren't meant to be buried, if they were constructed for a ground level that no longer exists, then something catastrophic must have happened to change the very landscape of our cities. Something sudden, something powerful, something that buried the lower levels of entire urban centers across the entire world, all within the same narrow window of time in the 1800s. And whatever that something was, it seems to have buried not just buildings, but an entire civilization along with them. A civilization whose name appears on every old map, Tartaria.
Here is where the two mysteries converge, the maps that show an empire erased from history, the buildings that appear buried by a force that shouldn't exist. They're not separate phenomena. They're evidence of the same story, a story that has been systematically removed from our textbooks, our museums, our collective memory. You've walked past these buildings your entire life. You've climbed stairs that once were grand entrances. You've studied maps that once showed Tartaria spanning continents. You've never questioned why the basement has windows too ornate for underground chambers. You've never asked why an empire could vanish from every atlas without explanation. But now that you see it, you can't unsee it. The question is no longer whether something strange appears in old photographs and antique maps. The question is, what happened in the 1800s? What event was powerful enough to bury the first floors of cities across the entire world? What force was coordinated enough to erase an entire civilization from every map, every textbook, every historical record? And perhaps most disturbing of all, why does no one seem to remember? This is not a story about conspiracy theories or internet speculation. This is a story about looking closely at the world you live in and recognizing that something fundamental doesn't make sense. real buildings with buried entrances, real maps with vanished empires, real photographs showing a ground level that no longer exists, real questions that have no satisfactory answers.
We're going to walk through the evidence together. We're going to examine the photographs that archivists filed away without understanding their significance. We're going to unfold the maps that cartographers created before someone decided the name Tartaria should disappear. We're going to visit the underground streets of Seattle, where an entire city level was buried and forgotten within living memory. We're going to study the mysterious fires that swept through major cities in the late 1800s, leaving behind only ruins that had to be rebuilt, or were they simply uncovered? We're going to investigate the impossible World's Fairs, where magnificent cities appeared in mere months, only to be demolished immediately after. We're going to trace the technology that might have been lost, buildings that could harvest atmospheric electricity, architectural knowledge that modern engineers struggle to replicate, construction techniques that we've had to reinvent because the originals were forgotten. And we're going to confront the possibility that we are living in a reset civilization, that the modern world was not built from scratch through industrial revolution, but constructed on top of something far older, far grander, far more sophisticated, that we are orphans of a forgotten legacy, inheriting magnificent buildings without understanding who built them or why they're half buried in the earth. The buildings are still here. They're standing in your city right now, with their windows beneath your feet and their doorways descending into darkness. The maps are still preserved in archives, showing an empire that every cartographer acknowledged, but that every modern historian ignores. The photographs are still filed in library collections, capturing a moment when the first floors were already underground, but no one thought to ask why. The evidence has been hiding in plain sight for over a century. The only question is, are we finally ready to see it?
There is something profoundly unsettling about watching an empire disappear. Not through war or conquest or natural disaster, but through something far more insidious, systematic erasure from the historical record itself. When you pull out a Dutch atlas from 1730, or a French geography text from 1780, or a British naval chart from 1820, you find the same name written across vast stretches of the Asian continent: Tartaria. Sometimes labeled as Great Tartary, sometimes subdivided into intricate regions: Chinese Tartary to the east, Muscovite Tartary to the west, Independent Tartary in the center. These weren't vague labels scrawled across blank spaces. They were detailed territorial designations, complete with cities, trade routes, and political boundaries. The cartographers who drew these maps treated Tartaria with the same geographical authority they gave to France, Spain, or the Ottoman Empire. This was not fringe speculation or a single mapmaker's error. Every major European cartographer acknowledged Tartaria's existence for over 200 years. The territory was massive, from the edges of Russia through Central Asia, possibly extending to the Pacific coast. Some maps show it controlling lands that would dwarf most European empires combined. Cities dot the landscape, rivers flow through marked provinces, mountain ranges divide the subdivisions. The detail suggests intimate knowledge, not guesswork. These mapmakers knew what they were documenting, and they documented it consistently across nations, languages, and centuries. Now open a modern atlas. Search for Tartaria. The word has vanished completely. The same geography remains, the same mountains, the same rivers, the same vast steppes, but the label is gone.
In its place, you find Russia, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, China, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, nations that appear to have emerged fully formed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. There is no gradual transition in the maps, no explanation in cartographic history for why such a dominant territorial designation would simply disappear. The change is abrupt, total, and eerily synchronized across the world's atlases.
You might assume this must be explained somewhere in academic literature. Surely historians have addressed why a region labeled on every major map for 2 centuries suddenly ceased to exist. So you search modern textbooks, you scan history courses, you look for museum exhibits, academic papers, encyclopedia entries. You find nothing. Tartaria appears in 0 modern textbooks, 0 university curricula, 0 mainstream historical discussions. The silence is deafening. An empire that occupied more map space than Europe itself has left no trace in modern education. This is not the absence of a minor detail. This is the disappearance of a civilization that cartographers worldwide acknowledged as a distinct political and geographical entity. The shock comes not from conspiracy, but from the simple recognition that something this large should have an explanation for its vanishing, yet none exists. You're left holding 2 incompatible realities: maps that prove Tartaria was recognized for centuries, and a modern world that acts as if it never existed at all.
The Chicago courthouse stands downtown, a monument to civic grandeur with its towering columns and intricate stone facades. Official records state it was completed in 1885, after just 2 years of construction. Walk around the building and really look at what that timeline demands. Each column is carved from single blocks of stone weighing multiple tons. The facade bears thousands of decorative elements, rosettes, cornices, sculptural reliefs, each requiring precision handiwork. The interior features marble staircases, vaulted ceilings with elaborate plasterwork, and hand-carved wooden panels in every courtroom. Now, calculate what it would take to produce this in 24 months using 19th century technology. The stone alone would need to be quarried, transported, carved by hand, and lifted into place using wooden scaffolding and rope pulleys. Each decorative element would require a master craftsman working for weeks or months. The mathematical reality doesn't support the timeline. Medieval cathedrals of similar scale and complexity took over a century to complete, and they had the advantage of generational continuity, fathers training sons in the same craft for decades.
The Boston Public Library presents the same paradox. Construction records claim it was built between 1888 and 1895. 7 years to create a palace of learning with soaring reading rooms, ornate murals covering entire walls, sculptural elements that would challenge modern artisans, and stonework so precise that mortar lines are nearly invisible. The building doesn't look hurried. It looks like the product of a civilization that had time, patience, and resources beyond what late 19th century America supposedly possessed. San Francisco City Hall tells an even stranger story. The current structure was officially built after the 1906 earthquake destroyed its predecessor, completed in just 11 years, despite being one of the most ornate government buildings in North America. Its dome rivals St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, yet we're told it was erected in a fraction of the time. The theory that emerges from these impossibilities is uncomfortable but logical. These buildings weren't built in the 1800s, they were inherited. Surviving structures from Tartaria that were claimed, repaired, and rebranded by the civilizations that came after.
This would explain not just the impossible timelines, but something even more striking: the architectural continuity across continents. Moscow's buildings around Red Square share the same design language as Chicago's World's Fair structures. Melbourne's Royal Exhibition Building echoes the same aesthetic principles as courthouses across America. Boston's grand libraries mirror the style of European opera houses that mirror Asian palaces. The similarity is too precise to be coincidence or cultural exchange. It suggests a single architectural tradition, one civilization's consistent approach to beauty, proportion, and craftsmanship spread across the entire world. Stand before these buildings with fresh eyes. See them not as relics of American or European achievement, but as survivors of something older. The sophistication we've taken for granted, the impossible craftsmanship, the mathematical precision, the reverence for beauty in every carved stone suddenly reveals itself as evidence. Evidence of a world that built with time and knowledge we've since lost. Evidence of Tartaria.
The 19th century burned. Chicago in 1871, reducing 3 square miles to ash in a single night. Boston followed in 1872, then again in 1873. Seattle's entire commercial district vanished in flames in 1889. Baltimore burned in 1904. San Francisco combined earthquake and fire in 1906 to destroy much of the city. These are the famous ones, the disasters that made headlines and history books. But the pattern extends far beyond these well-documented catastrophes. New York experienced multiple devastating fires throughout the century. London burned repeatedly. Paris faced flames that consumed entire districts. Smaller cities across America and Europe reported similar destruction with unsettling frequency. When you map these fires chronologically and geographically, a disturbing pattern emerges. The concentration of major urban fires within a 50-year window seems statistically improbable. Fire is random by nature, yet these blazes appear almost systematic. Major cities burning and rebuilding in rapid succession across continents. What happened after each fire is even more curious than the fires themselves. The official narrative speaks of reconstruction, of cities rising from the ashes more modern and more grand than before. But examine the specifics and the story becomes stranger. After nearly every major fire, the rebuilding process included raising the street level by 5, 10, sometimes 15 feet. In Chicago, entire neighborhoods were elevated. Streets were filled with debris and new pavement laid on top. Buildings that survived the fire found their ground floors suddenly underground. Original entrances became basements. First-floor windows ended up below the new street level. The same pattern repeated in Seattle and San Francisco, in Boston. The explanation given was always practical: improved drainage, better urban planning, modernization. But the effect was always the same. The original ground level was buried and sealed. Consider an alternative interpretation. What if the mud flood had already occurred? What if cities across the world were already partially buried, damaged, their lower levels filled with sediment from some catastrophic event? The architectural landscape would have been chaotic. Grand Tartarian buildings half submerged, their purposes obscured, their designs incompatible with the needs of a recovering civilization. The fires could have served a convenient dual purpose: destroy what couldn't be salvaged and provide justification for the massive earth moving required to raise streets and bury the evidence of what came before. Photographs from the immediate aftermath of these fires show something peculiar. Many buildings appear intact, but partially buried even before the flames touched them. The fire damage often seems to affect only the upper portions of structures whose lower floors were already underground.
Were these fires tragic accidents born of wooden construction and inadequate fire safety? Or were they something more deliberate, a systematic erasure of architectural evidence, a coordinated effort to reset urban landscapes and bury the remnants of a civilization that wasn't supposed to be remembered? The horror isn't just in considering the possibility of coordinated destruction. It's in recognizing that if cultural heritage was deliberately erased, it was done so thoroughly that we now call the evidence progress.
There is something deeply unsettling about walking through a street that no longer exists. In Seattle, you can descend a narrow staircase behind an ordinary storefront and find yourself in another world. The Seattle Underground Tour takes you through what were once sidewalks, now sealed beneath the modern city. Storefronts with their display windows still intact line corridors that used to be open air. Signs advertising long-defunct businesses hang in the gloom. Staircases lead to nowhere because the buildings they once connected are gone. The ceiling above you, pressing down with its weight of concrete and asphalt, was once the sky. People walked here freely, conducted business, lived ordinary lives at this level. Then, after the fire of 1889, the city made a decision. Rather than rebuild at the same elevation, they would raise the streets one full story higher to solve chronic flooding problems. The old ground level was simply abandoned, sealed, forgotten within a single generation. The official explanation is documented, practical, understandable, but the effect remains profoundly strange. An entire layer of urban civilization erased from daily consciousness, buried but not destroyed, waiting in the darkness beneath the feet of people who have no idea it's there. If this could happen in documented history with clear records and living witnesses, what about cities where the documentation is incomplete or missing entirely? San Francisco raised its street levels by 10 to 12 feet after the earthquake and fire of 1906. Chicago elevated entire neighborhoods following the 1871 blaze, lifting buildings on jacks and filling the spaces beneath with debris until the old streets became buried basements. The phenomenon is not isolated to America. London has been building on top of itself for so long that Roman streets lie far beneath the modern pavement, accessible only through excavation. In Rome, the ancient forums that once stood at ground level now sit 20 feet or more below current streets. Archaeologists descend through layers like geologists reading rock strata, medieval above Renaissance, above Roman, above something even older. Every major city contains these buried levels. Excavations regularly uncover unexplained chambers, sealed rooms, structures that don't align with the accepted timeline of development. Historical societies keep records of buildings whose basements have windows too ornate for underground spaces, whose foundations extend far deeper than engineering would require. The standard explanation invokes centuries of gradual accumulation. Dust, debris, construction waste slowly raising the ground level over time. But what if the accumulation wasn't gradual? What if what we attribute to centuries of slow buildup actually happened in decades during a single catastrophic event? The Tartarian burial wouldn't have been a conscious choice in most places. It would have been necessity, dealing with cities half submerged by mud, their lower levels damaged or inaccessible, their architecture belonging to a civilization that no longer existed. Walking through Seattle Underground, you feel the grief of forgotten worlds. This isn't ancient history sealed under millennia. This is your great-grandparents' city, buried and abandoned in living memory. If it happened here, where we have documentation, how many other cities carry buried levels we've simply stopped noticing? How many times have we built on top of ourselves without realizing what we're standing on? The photographs of the Chicago World's Fair of 1893 show something that should not be possible. The White City, as it was called, covered over 600 acres with more than 200 buildings of breathtaking grandeur. Massive colonnades, elaborate domes rivaling European cathedrals, sculptural facades that would challenge master artisans, reflecting pools and ornate bridges and towering monuments that made visitors weep at their beauty. The official story claims all of this was constructed in under 2 years using a material called staff, a temporary mixture of plaster, fiber, and cement spread over wooden frames. Yet when you examine the photographs closely, the buildings don't look temporary. They show weathering patterns, surface cracks, and stone-like qualities inconsistent with fresh plaster. The architectural details seem impossible for the claimed materials, heavy foundations that suggest permanence, engineering sophistication that exceeds what temporary structures would require, decorative elements that would take skilled craftsmen years to produce, even in actual stone. The Chicago Fair was not an anomaly. Paris hosted a massive exposition in 1889 featuring structures so grand they seemed designed to last centuries rather than months. Buffalo's Pan-American Exposition of 1901 created elaborate palaces across hundreds of acres. St. Louis in 1904 produced a monumental city in an impossibly short time frame. San Francisco's 1915 exposition built temporary structures that looked more ancient than contemporary. Each fair followed the same pattern, breathtaking architecture appearing almost overnight, drawing millions of visitors, then being demolished immediately after closing. Nearly every building was destroyed within months of the fair's end. The official explanation speaks of temporary construction making preservation impractical, of the materials degrading too quickly to maintain. But the question haunts anyone who studies the photographs. Why would a civilization invest such extraordinary effort into creating beauty designed to last only months? Consider an alternative theory. These buildings weren't new constructions at all. They were surviving Tartarian structures that had weathered the mud flood and the subsequent fires but remained standing, magnificent and incompatible with the narrative of 19th century progress. The World's Fairs provided perfect cover, a final public revealing of these architectural wonders before their systematic destruction. Millions could marvel at the beauty while being told it was modern achievement, temporary genius. Then, after the crowds dispersed, the evidence could be demolished under the guise of removing temporary structures. Some buildings were supposedly preserved, but their stories are revealing. San Francisco's Palace of Fine Arts, one of the few fair structures that still stands, required such extensive reconstruction it was essentially rebuilt from scratch in the 1960s. If the original was simple plaster over wood, why would such total reconstruction be necessary? The anger comes from imagining irreplaceable cultural heritage destroyed for political purposes. If these were truly Tartarian buildings, survivors of a lost civilization, then the fairs represented not celebration, but erasure, a final exhibition before annihilation. The beauty was real, the craftsmanship was authentic, but the story told about their origins was a lie, designed to prepare the public for their destruction. Why destroy something so magnificent if you just built it? Unless you didn't build it. unless it was evidence of something you needed the world to forget.
Look up at any grand building from the 19th century and notice what crowns its highest point: a dome topped with an elaborate metal finial, a spire reaching skyward with copper plating, a tower bearing geometric metalwork that seems far too precise to be merely decorative. These features appear on courthouses, libraries, capitol buildings, opera houses, and cathedrals across the world. We've been taught they're ornamental, aesthetic flourishes meant to add grandeur and beauty, but examine them more closely and a different possibility emerges. The metal components aren't random, they're mathematically precise, geometrically intentional, positioned to catch something from the atmosphere itself. The domes aren't just architectural statements, they're shaped like resonance chambers. The copper covering isn't decorative luxury, it's conductive material placed at the optimal point for capturing atmospheric electricity. Beneath these buildings lie chambers whose original purposes remain mysteriously unclear. Historical records call them basements or storage, but their engineering seems excessive for such mundane functions. Ventilation shafts run through the structures in configurations that appear over-designed for simple air circulation. The metalwork throughout the buildings forms intricate frameworks that serve no obvious structural purpose. What if these weren't decorative or utilitarian features at all? What if Tartarian buildings were machines disguised as architecture? Sophisticated systems for harvesting and distributing free energy from the atmosphere itself. Nikola Tesla spent years in the 1890s and early 1900s experimenting with exactly this concept. He believed the earth and sky formed a natural electrical circuit that could power devices without wires or fuel. He claimed ancient civilizations had understood this principle and that humanity had lost the knowledge. His Wardenclyffe Tower was an attempt to resurrect atmospheric electricity transmission, an effort that was mysteriously abandoned and later demolished. If Tesla was attempting to rediscover what Tartaria had already mastered, it would explain the architectural features we've dismissed as ornamental. It would explain why these buildings are so grand despite supposedly limited 19th century resources, because energy wasn't scarce in a civilization that could harvest it freely from the air. It would explain the spacious interiors without visible mechanical systems, the lack of fuel storage, the absence of chimneys or power generation equipment. The buildings themselves were the power system. After Tartaria fell, this technology would have been lost or deliberately suppressed. The modern industrial revolution wasn't progress, it was regression, forced to reinvent inferior systems based on combustion and extraction because the knowledge of atmospheric energy harvesting had been buried along with the civilization. We learned to burn coal, then oil, then gas, creating scarcity and environmental destruction, while above our heads the rusting remains of a superior technology sit ignored on buildings we walk past daily. The copper domes tarnish, the metal spires corrode, the geometric precision goes unnoticed. We're told they're beautiful, and they are, but their beauty might be the least important thing about them. Imagine a world where energy flowed freely, where buildings harmonized with natural forces rather than dominating them, where scarcity was unnecessary because the atmosphere itself provided abundance. That world might not be fantasy, it might be history, Tartarian history, buried beneath our feet and rusting above our heads while we tell ourselves we're living in an age of technological advancement. Perhaps we're not advancing. Perhaps we're still recovering from a fall.
What force could bury entire cities across the world in a matter of years or decades rather than centuries? The geological possibilities are terrifying in their scope and power.
Massive liquefaction events during prolonged seismic activity could destabilize ground across vast regions, causing structures to sink while surrounding Earth rose in compensating waves. Rapid sea level changes or successive tsunami series could deposit layers of sediment far inland, burying coastal and riverside cities under mud carried from ocean floors. Volcanic eruptions, releasing ash clouds that settled over years, could accumulate like slow-motion burial, compressing and hardening into the Earth itself. Atmospheric electrical events of unprecedented scale might destabilize ground through mechanisms we barely understand, creating conditions where soil behaves like liquid before solidifying again at new elevations. The early 19th century provides disturbing clues. The New Madrid earthquakes of 1811 and 1812 were so powerful they altered the course of the Mississippi River and rang church bells in Boston over 1,000 miles away. Witnesses reported the ground rolling in visible waves, forests sinking into newly formed swamps, and landscapes transformed overnight. Then, in 1815, Mount Tambora erupted with such force that 1816 became known as the year without summer. Crops failed across the northern hemisphere, snow fell in June, temperatures plummeted globally. But beyond the immediate climate impact, the eruption released ash that lingered in the atmosphere for years, settling slowly across the world. Climate records from the early 1800s show persistent anomalies, unusual weather patterns, atmospheric disturbances, reports of strange phenomena that don't align with our understanding of normal conditions. What if these weren't isolated events, but symptoms of something larger? A combination of seismic instability and atmospheric catastrophe occurring simultaneously or in rapid succession. Liquefaction during earthquakes causing buildings to sink, ash rain and mud deposits accumulating faster than populations could clear them, ground levels rising while structures descended. The timeline fits uncomfortably well. Major disturbances in the 1810s, decades of disruption, and by the 1850s, photographs show cities where buildings already appear partially buried. People stand at what is now second-floor level as if it were ground level. The burial wasn't gradual accumulation over centuries, it was rapid catastrophe compressed into decades. Photographs from the 1850s through 1870s capture cities in transition, buildings clearly designed for one ground level now sitting partially submerged, streets raised, doorways buried, windows underground. These aren't images of ancient ruins slowly consumed by time. These are pictures of recent catastrophe captured by early cameras in the immediate aftermath, while survivors were still adapting to the altered landscape. The question that haunts this evidence is, if such a catastrophe occurred, why aren't there extensive written records? The possible answer is more disturbing than comfortable. Literacy disrupted, libraries destroyed, records lost in the chaos, survivors scattered and focused on immediate survival rather than documentation, and perhaps most chilling, deliberate suppression by whoever emerged in power afterward, rewriting the narrative to erase what actually happened. The terror isn't just in imagining such rapid global catastrophe, it's recognizing our vulnerability to repetition. If it happened once in documented history, what prevents it from happening again?
If Tartaria existed as a sophisticated civilization spanning continents, then who were the Tartarians? The question becomes immediately personal because the answer might be us. Historical documents do contain references to Tartars and Tartary, though often in pejorative terms written by those who conquered or displaced them. This pattern is familiar in history. Winners write the narrative, losers get erased or demonized. But erasure doesn't mean extinction. It means integration, assimilation, the scattering of a population that survives but loses its collective identity. After the Mud Flood Catastrophe, surviving Tartarians wouldn't have vanished. They would have integrated into other societies, carried forward by people who gradually forgot where they came from as new powers rewrote the maps and history books. We might be descended from them without knowing it. The cultural remnants could be hiding in Sight Plain, dismissed as coincidence or attributed to other sources. Architectural techniques preserved within secret societies and guilds, passed down through initiations that hint at older knowledge, folk tales scattered across continents speaking of giants or old ones who built the ancient structures, stories we've relegated to mythology rather than recognizing as distorted cultural memory. Widespread flood myths that appear in disconnected cultures worldwide, perhaps not metaphorical, but literal memories of the catastrophe that buried their ancestors' civilization. Advanced metallurgy and construction techniques that seem to appear suddenly in the historical record, possibly not innovations, but rediscoveries of Tartarian knowledge. The modern ethnic groups living in former Tartarian territories raise uncomfortable questions. Were they always there, indigenous populations predating Tartaria? Or are they the survivors, descendants who inherited the label of whatever new nation-state carved up the empire's remains? The question becomes even more provocative when examining colonialism through this lens. Did European powers genuinely discover and civilize vast regions, or did they move into a power vacuum created by Tartaria's fall? Were they colonizers bringing progress to primitive lands, or scavengers claiming the ruins of a more advanced civilization and rebranding the inheritance as their own achievement? This reframes human history entirely. Instead of the comfortable progress narrative, primitive to ancient to medieval to modern, each era building upon the last in steady advancement, we face the possibility of cyclical rise and fall. Civilizations reaching heights of sophistication, then collapsing, then slowly recovering while forgetting what was lost. We're not standing at the pinnacle of human achievement. We might be recovering from a fall, rebuilding on foundations we don't understand, living in buildings we didn't construct, using techniques we had to painfully reinvent because the originals were buried along with those who understood them. The personal question cuts deepest. Who am I if my ancestors' civilization was erased? If the culture that built the magnificent structures around us, that mastered free energy and created beauty as a fundamental principle, if that civilization was deliberately written out of history and I carry its blood without knowing, what does that make me? An heir who never received the inheritance? An orphan who never knew they had parents? The existential grief is profound. It's the grief of discovering you had a family legacy of greatness that was stolen before you could claim it, that was buried so thoroughly you grew up thinking you came from nothing, that your people built nothing, that everything around you was gifted by others rather than inherited from your own ancestors. The buildings stand silent witnesses, and they might be telling us who we really are. Not everyone forgot. Even as the maps were redrawn and the textbooks rewritten, some people kept the memory alive. Family oral histories passed down through generations contradict official timelines. Grandparents whispering to grandchildren about the old world, about buildings that existed before the fires, about ancestors who spoke of a time when the ground level was lower and the cities looked different. Indigenous peoples across continents maintain stories of before times, of buried cities and vanished empires, narratives that academic historians dismiss as mythology, but which align suspiciously well with the physical evidence still visible in the architecture around us. Secret societies and esoteric traditions have long referenced lost civilizations in their teachings, knowledge preserved through ritual and symbol rather than written record, protected from those who sought to erase it from public consciousness. The modern resistance is digital and global. Investigators across continents have formed networks, sharing photographs of buried buildings, scanning old maps before libraries update their collections, comparing architectural anomalies from cities that have never communicated. The internet has created what institutions tried to prevent: collective memory built from distributed evidence, thousands of observers noticing the same patterns independently and realizing they're not alone in seeing what doesn't make sense. This is preservation as resistance. People photograph buried architecture before demolition crews arrive, knowing that once the physical evidence is destroyed, only the images will remain. They archive maps showing Tartaria before they disappear from digital collections. They record interviews with elderly family members who heard stories from their own grandparents, creating chains of memory that skip across the gap where official history goes silent. The call to action is simple but profound. Become a keeper yourself. Visit the old buildings in your city, not as a tourist, but as an investigator. Research when they were supposedly built and compare that to photographic evidence from the era. Look for the telltale signs: windows too ornate for basements, doorways that descend below street level, foundations that extend far deeper than they should. Document what you find. Photograph the buried windows and sunken doorways before they're covered by renovations or lost to demolition. Share your findings with others who are looking. Build the network. Add your piece to the collective memory being assembled across the world. Every person who sees the buried buildings and questions the official narrative is performing an act of remembrance. Every photograph shared, every map archived, every family story recorded is a resurrection, bringing Tartaria back to consciousness, one observer at a time. The civilization was buried physically and historically, but burial is not the same as death. Memory can restore what force tried to destroy. If enough people remember, if enough people refuse to accept the sanitized version of history that erases an entire empire from existence, then perhaps the civilization lives again. Not in physical form, but in consciousness, in recognition, in the collective acknowledgement that something magnificent existed and deserves to be honored rather than forgotten. The buildings are still here, waiting to be seen. The maps are still preserved, waiting to be examined. The stories are still whispered, waiting to be heard. The only question is whether we have the courage to become keepers of what others tried to bury.
Tartaria may have been buried, but it wasn't destroyed. It's beneath us, around us, built into the very fabric of our cities. Every ornate courthouse, every grand library, every railway station with soaring ceilings, they might be speaking a language we forgot how to hear. But language can be relearned, memory can be recovered, civilizations can be resurrected, one question at a time. The buildings are still here, they're still beautiful, they're still impossible to explain away. And now that you see them, you can never unsee them. Welcome to the investigation. Welcome to remembering. Tartaria is not lost, it was hidden, and we're bringing it back to light.